Hello, everybody. My name is Maurice Button. I'm the CEO of City and Financial Global, and it's my pleasure today to be interviewing Marcus Thompson, who's a partner at Kirkland and Ellis International. Marcus is going to be speaking at our forthcoming conference entitled the Economic Sanctions Summit 2023, which is being held at the Hannam Conference Centre in London on the 31st of January. Marcus, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure entirely. So let's go to the questions, Marcus. The first one, the Economic Crime Act was introduced to facilitate the enforcement of sanctions against Russian oligarchs and other overseas owners. What do you think the practical impact has been of this so far?
Well, I think that the short and immediate answer is it's probably a little bit too early to tell. But just before going into that in a bit more detail, just to remind everybody, from a sanctions perspective, probably the most significant aspect of the Act is to create the ability for OFSI in particular to impose a strict liability test rather than under the old regime, whereby essentially you had to know that you were committing a sanctions offence for you to be guilty of a sanctions offence. So as a result of the Act, one can now commit a sanctions offence, but a civil offence, even though you didn't know you were doing it. And so there's been, some views expressed about that in the sense of people make mistakes, and that's not fair. But that is the regime that we now have, and it's very similar to the regime that's existed in the United States for some time. I suppose the obvious point and the direct answer to your question is it puts even more pressure on businesses which are already struggling, frankly, to deal with the tidal wave of sanctions that we've had since the end of February last year. And it creates a much easier environment in which prosecution of offences can happen, but under a civil regime rather than a criminal regime.
And do you think it will drive overseas owners to locate their assets outside the UK, just to be on the safe side from that point of view?
So this is the other feature of the Act, in addition to the civil liability test for sanctions, as you'll know, is this creation of a register of overseas interests. And this has been something that was talked about for a long time and pushed by Private Eye and many others for years and years. And then as a result of the invasion, the legislation was all passed in a screaming hurry when everyone decided that it suddenly became even more important. Now, the transitional period for the provisions dealing with the obligation to register overseas interests, registering with Companies House, that ends on the 31st of January, which I believe is the same day as the conference.
It is indeed. That's good timing.
So again, it's a similar answer I gave a moment ago. It is still, I think, very early to tell whether this new obligation to register and verify the beneficial owners of overseas entities who own property in the UK, whether that's going to drive people away from owning property in the UK. My own view, for what it's worth, is that it won't. And certainly I think the government's view is that if it drives anybody away, it's precisely the people who the UK government would not want owning property in the UK. Essentially, if you're not prepared to tell the government who you are as an overseas entity, the government doesn't want you owning property in the UK. And so if those people are driven away, I think the government would regard that as job done.
Yeah, understood. I mean, the EU and the US have taken a slightly different approach to the UK and the entities that are sanctioned. Do you have any advice for organisations who are affected by all three jurisdictions as how they can ensure that they're not in breach?
This is something that obviously I spend a lot of time with clients on, and I suppose the slightly glib answer is I feel very sorry for people who are having to comply with all three of those regimes, because it is really hard. It was difficult before the war started, and now we've had, in the last, whatever it is, 9-10 months, more sanctions in the last 10 months than I think we've had in the last 10 or even 20 years. So in addition to the complexity of just the UK sanctions or just the EU or just the US sanctions, if you are a business that has to navigate all three of those, where they are broadly the same, and they are broadly the same, but there are important differences, it is very difficult. So I suppose the first bit of advice I'd give is don't be too hard on yourself if you're finding it tough, because everybody is finding it tough, and I can say that as an advisor to lots of different businesses. It is difficult. There is no magic solution to it other than, I suppose, two things. One, being across the detail in the first place and understanding, and there's no way any one person can know all of the sanctions from all of the regimes across all of the sectors. I don't think it's physically possible. So the key thing is to focus on the areas that really matter to your business. So if you're a bank, you're going to be focused on the sanctions that relate to the world of financial services, but you're also probably going to have an eye on the sanctions that apply to your customers, because that will have a bearing on the business that you can take on. But you won't need, for example, to have an eye on travel bans or other things that might not be relevant to your business. So focus on the areas that matter to your business and know what those are. The second thing is, once you know what those issues are, you have to stay on top of them, because they change. The EU is now on whatever it is, it's soon to be the 10th package. We had the 9th package just before Christmas. The UK, I forget how many regulations and amendments we've had to the Russia regulations now, but many. And executive orders appear from the United States without any warning whatsoever, because they have the legal ability to pass sanctions, at the drop of a hat. So it's not just knowing what the rules are at one particular moment, it's staying on top of those rules.
Okay. Russia's the first global superpower to be subject to such draconian sanctions. Where do you think the next focus for sanctions might be, and how do you think it will impact global trade and organizations with international trading partners?
That is an excellent question. It's also a really difficult question, and one that I know is troubling the minds of chancelleries and foreign offices and state departments around the world at the moment. I mean, I guess the obvious point is that an escalation of sanctions will happen as a result of an escalation of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, and hopefully it stays on the ground in Ukraine. Obviously, if the war spills over into Russia, for example, if Ukraine makes more incursions into Russia will react proportionately, and whatever happens on the ground will be reflected in an escalation in sanctions. We've already gone further than I think anyone ever thought we would, and there are not just new sanctions, but new sanctions concepts are being developed all the time. The two things that people, I think, that speaking to clients, that people are focused on the most at the moment and worrying about the most. One, I suppose, is the possibility, which I think is theoretical, but nevertheless a possibility, that the US imposes something similar to the so-called comprehensive countrywide sanctions on Russia that exist at the moment against Cuba and Iran, for example. The reason I think that's theoretical is because Cuba and Iran are small economies, as you sort of hinted in your question. Cuba, Iran are fairly small economies. Comprehensive sanctions sort of work to a point against small economies. I think the jury is very much out on whether a similar approach would work against Russia, and the knock-on effects that would have to European businesses if the US essentially shut Russia off to US business and dollar-denominated transactions would be enormous and very difficult to quantify. But that's one possible escalation. The other sanctions-related issue, which is not Russia-focused, is what happens with China and Taiwan, and what would be the response from the West in response to any action by China against Taiwan, whether it was a blockade or something more serious. And again, that's a crystal ball effort, but it is something I know that governments at the moment are focused on and are drawing up plans to implement should it be necessary.
Yes, I mean that opens up a huge new area, doesn't it? Marcus, we're out of time, so thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on these issues today. And we look forward very much to hearing more from you at the Economic Sanctions Summit 2023 at the Hannam Conference Centre on the 31st of January. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.